Welcome to So Very Easy. My name is Laura, and let's make a quilt that will start with the big 8-inch square, which means this quilt is going to go together really fast. And we're going to be able to use those fun prints that, well, we just don't want to cut up. Let's get started. The fabric lineup is from Dear Stella. It has these great faces and beer bottles, words, and some deer. It's just a fun line. I'm going to name this quilt Beards and Beer. Because we get to use big pieces, it will showcase the fabric. And it all starts with an 8-inch square. And this is how the block looks. You're going to start with that great big 8-inch square. You have triangles, which will make another square. Add triangles, and it makes a really big square. And you'll get to trim it down so they're all going to be exact. So let's start with choosing the fabric for the center. How many squares do you need to cut? Well, that's going to be all up to you. Do you want it only to have 4 patches, 3 by 3, larger? It's all going to be up to you. When you have the center squares cut, we can decide on the outside colors. Each of these triangles start off with a 5-inch square cut in half. I want 2 dark on one side, 2 medium on the other, a light and a nice kicker fabric. So we have the 5-inch of each of the colors cut in half. What we need to do is sew them together in units. These are going to go together, these two, and these two. Now they are different. They are opposite, and they're opposite on both colors. Now there are other ways that you can cut these out and sew them together, but I just like to do the triangles, and that way I can lay them out on a board and know exactly how they're going to look before I start sewing them together. So let's put the back. So here would be the center block, and that is going to be center seams. So when we go to match these up afterwards, we know they're going to fit right into the centers. If you have 9 of these blocks, you're going to need 9 of each of these triangles to match. If you have 12, you're going to need 12. Now that we know how it's going to be laid out, we're going to be able to take them to the machine and sew them. I like to do one side at a time, and when I'm finished sewing that stack, I'm going to put it right back on my board to keep myself straight. I'm going to sew this seam along here. So when you match them up, those sides are going to match perfectly. So I'll take this to the machine and sew those 2 piles together. When your first stack is done, you can press the seams in any direction that you want. But I like the quilt to remain as flat as possible, and I want to use that center line as a measurement. So I like to press it open and flat. Pick up the next 2 and sew that pile. I'm going to do the same for all the piles, putting them right back to where they should be. With all of the piles done, we need to sew these onto this center square. And we're going to find some marks in this center square. Very easily done. Fold that square in half and iron just this little section here. You don't need to iron the whole piece, just these 2 corners. And then fold it in the other direction and press those 2 areas. Those little press marks are going to line up with those center marks on those triangles. You need to start with 2 sides first, match them, and sew them together. Match up that center seam with that center press. You're going to have a nice big hangover on each side. That way we can trim them down. Stitch a 1/4 inch all the way down. You need to do that for one side and for the other side. And it doesn't matter what side you start with. With those 2 ends on, you can take this and press it towards that center. And when you press it, just be sure you don't unpress those marks on the other 2 sides. You can cut off these little ends if you want, or you can sew right over top of them. Match up that centered line with that press line on the 2 opposite sides and stitch a 1/4 inch all the way down. You're going to come right off of those edges. Now with the seam as a guide, I'm going to trim off those ends. And I'll use just a pair of scissors. The next seams, press the bigger square out. This square now can be trimmed down to 11 inches. On each of these corners, you need to leave a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Each of these edges are going to be on the bias. So you can give this a good starch first before you cut it, and it's just going to stabilize it a little bit better. And when the 11 inch is cut, we can put 4 more corners on. I'll stack all my finished squares and put my 4 corners on my board. And this way I know I'm going to keep it straight. In the same system that we stitched these on, we need to stitch the corners on. So we're going to stitch 2 onto the one side and then 2 on the other. We're going to use these center lines as a guide. Let me show you an easy way to match up this mark with the center of that triangle. Take the triangle and just lay it on top of the side that you want it sewn on. So these are the 2 edges I want matching. I'm going to take that triangle in the top and match it together. With that seam folded in half, that half mark on this larger triangle is going to match that point right there. Place it there so that fold lines right up, and I can pin it and stitch it down. When the 2 edges are on, press that seam open. You can trim those ears off now or do them later. I'm going to do the same thing with these corners. Fold it in half, match my point, open it up, and stitch a 1/4 inch. I'm going to put the 2 opposite sides on. Trim off those ears and press. So the layout of the block has my center square and then this darker corner. This darker corner, when it's all sewn together, is going to look like a big shadow from this block. So I have a block, and this would look like a block underneath this block. So that is why I've chosen that dark to go in that corner. However, you can lay it out any way you would like. This block will need to be trimmed down to a 1/4 inch to each of those points. And when this block is all trimmed up, it will equal 15.5 inches. And that gives us that 1/4 inch on each of those intersections. Now we're going to be able to sew this together to make the quilt. And if you only have 4 blocks, you'd be able to sew them together with the darker sides outside. Gives you a great spot in the center to do some quilting, and it gives you a star. If you put the dark in the center, it gives you another layout. Let's do every other one. So I'm going to put 2 dark ones in the corner and 2 dark in the center. It still gives another nice arrangement. So even with 4 blocks, this is a fun quilt to make. The only thing you would have to decide on is if the pictures are going to go in the direction that you want. With 12 blocks, I'm going to be able to get 4 rows with 3 squares in each row. And when you add more than 4, you really can see those shadows. The first border that's going to go on is this red. I'm going to cut the strips at 2.5 inches. When that red border is put on, the next is going to be these beer bottles. So for the top and the bottom of the quilt, I'm going to be able to cut the borders right from the width of the fabric. But for the sides, I'm going to want to be able to cut it from the length, and that way my bottles are going to be standing upright all the way around the quilt. So let me show you how to cut these long sides, just in case you happen to have a border that you'd like to do this to. So for the top and the border, I'm going to be able to cut right along that width of the fabric. So my 2 selvages are together in the fold, and those will be just taken right off the top. For the length, I need to cut it the length of the fabric. You'll need to take your fabric and match up the selvage on the same selvage edge. So you're going to take that and fold it. So it's right there on that selvage. So you're going to have the whole width in this direction. So that is the same piece of selvage. So this will always remain the 45 inches, where this is going to dictate how many yards or inches you have left. I'd like my border at 3.5 inches. So first thing I'm going to do is trim off that selvage. Use that fold line as a guide making sure that fold line is straight, and then trim that selvage off. Now I have a straight edge I'm going to be able to work with. I'll be able to cut 3.5 inches and continue to cut that 3.5 inches until I get enough that I'm going to be able to go on the sides of the quilt. And with each 3.5 inch border, I'm going to make sure that I have a straight line right along that fold. If you don't have a long enough piece to go on the edges, you will have to piece these borders together. Traditionally, we do like to sew them on an angle. And by sewing that on an angle, you're not going to realize that those bottles are not matching up. Now, if you're using a design where you're going to be able to use an actual straight edge, then by all means, match it up to the straight edge. So here's the difference. This is the 45-degree angle, and this is the straight zone. But whatever you have is what you need to work with, so choose what is best for your application. So now I will be able to do the two side borders, the top and bottom, and all my bottles are going to be upright. And I'm going to be sure to keep my bottles going all in the same direction. So this quilt will actually have a top and a bottom. It won't be reversible because I have the center panels here cut so there is a direction to them. One last border on, cut at 4.5 inches. So we have 3 borders cut at 2.5 inches, 3.5 inches, and 4.5 inches. If you have made 12 blocks and have added these borders on, the quilt is going to be 66.5 inches by 82.5 inches. So the fabric I've used was a 1/2 yard of the 2 dark grays and the light color, 1 yard of each of those novelty prints, and this is the one that I was using inside. I also wanted to use some of the beer bottles inside the quilt, so I added a little bit extra with the beer bottles. You will only need 1 yard of this, but I like to have a little bit more so I can cut that length of that border. So I would recommend buying 2. So you'd have 1/2 yard, 1 yard, and each of these you're going to need 2 yards. That's going to give you binding, that big border, and that nice long border with the beer bottles going all in the same direction. And when you stand back, that black shadow is very apparent. This is a very good block to use if you're using very large prints or novelty prints. That way you don't cut up the novelty print or the picture. You're going to be able to get all of that picture in there. It is the black fabric or a dark gray that's giving it that dimension. Other than that, you can change the fabrics around the outside and it still will give it that look. Add a couple of borders on and it is very quick to finish with those big 15.5 inch blocks. This fabric with the beards and the beer was a lot of fun to make, so now my beards and beer quilt is now done. And that was not so very easy to say. Thank you for joining me today on Sew Very Easy. Feel free to subscribe, and as always, come on back. Let's see what we're sewing next time in the sewing room. Bye for now.